Microsoft is calling it the biggest shift in computing since it gave up DOS commands and went to graphics. That means no more mice, no more keyboards. It's all hands-on. King 5's Glenn Farley tonight with the latest in technology.
So this really shows you how realistic technology can be.
You can play in the water without getting wet.
No. Yes.
Have you ever put together a jigsaw puzzle when the picture was actually moving?
We absolutely see surfaces, right, becoming smart. Whether it's in your countertop, or whether it's a freestanding coffee table, a kitchen table, or on the wall. It will do multi-touch.
Microsoft Corporate VP Tom Gibbons gives us the interactive tour. It's called Surface Computing. You can do it without the interface of a mouse.
So we'll do logic recognition.
How about ordering something off a virtual restaurant menu?
So we go into this restaurant.
Yeah. And I can just take stuff here and I can drag it in.
And when it comes time to pay, just lay down your credit card, divvy up the bill, add in the tip, and leave. Under the screen are cameras that can actually see what you're touching, and then the computer reacts, creating an image.
There we go. And again, we just put it down here, and it spills out.
Photos, not a problem. It's like they're magically drawn out of your digital camera into the box, wirelessly.
So you can grab photos, and I can grab photos. We can make bigger,
Smaller white table in this case.
In this case, it is. And so we've used those different attributes of surface computing in this application to create a totally different kind of experience. If you've got video you want running, you can actually play the video.
The first of these units will go into bars, restaurants, casinos, and retail stores. But when can you get one for your home?
We are shooting for around 3 to 4 years.
Price tag within a whole budget. In Redmond, Glenn Farley, King5 News.
Right now, commercial units are expected to sell between $5,000 and $10,000. You should start seeing them in bars and restaurants in November.
We watched 2 videos there. The first one was about e-paper. That basically you can put, by linking paper, in essence, I mean, maybe a little bit thicker paper, like more like what we call cardboard, that you might make a box out of or something. You can make paper that also does surface computing. So in essence, you can, what it was demonstrating was a newspaper that was using both sides of this piece of thick paper, and every time it turned over, it got a new image, and so the entire newspaper was being revealed on this sheet of paper, and without a computer, without a mobile phone, without anything like that, and it was a good size. It was basically, they showed it was a broadsheet sheet of paper. Now, I think broadsheet is bigger than they need, so I think the tabloid size would have been fine with what they were showing. But the point is that we are already in a situation where newspapers could transition to e-paper if they figured out an economic model to do it. I've told you before, before I say that, the second video is almost 10 years old. So the surface computing that the Microsoft VP was demonstrating is 10 years old now. And yet, I don't think any of you have seen that in restaurants or in homes yet. So even though they invented it and they were hoping to put it out in the market almost 10 years ago, they didn't. So why didn't they do it? They had the technology to do it, so why didn't they do it? The reason why they didn't do it is because they didn't create a market for it. Nobody wanted it. I've told you before the story of sliced bread. That sliced bread, the bread slicer was created in about 1910 or 1912. It was not adopted in America until the middle of the Great Depression, which is kind of an odd time for it to have caught hold. But an innovative company called Wonder Bread figured out some ways to market sliced bread. And so in a 3-year period of time, I think in 1933 to 1936, most people in America transitioned to sliced bread, even though it was a Great Depression. I spent the last 9 years I've been in Kazakhstan, and they don't have sliced bread. Not to say they can't do it. Actually, they have about less than 1% of their bread that is sold is sliced bread. So nobody has marketed sliced bread adequately to the Kazakhs. Not because it doesn't exist. It's existed for over 100 years, or about 100, a little bit over 100 years now, but not in Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan is a fairly well-to-do country. They have, they're oil rich. They have maybe too many billionaires and not enough middle class, but they still have lots of people who drive cars and so forth. Not a poor country compared to Kyrgyzstan or Uzbekistan or some of the other stands. And yet they don't use sliced bread. So that is only to compare it to modern technology. We have modern technology that could make the world a very different place, but nobody's figured out how to market it to people. And this last video was an example of that. They wanted to launch it within even to homes within the next 4 years, and that was done about 10 years ago. And I haven't seen it in any homes. So they have the technology, they haven't marketed it right. Now that also relates to why people haven't transitioned to online newspapers or online local TV stations. Is that in order to do that, for the newspapers to get people to abandon their printed newspaper and go to the online newspaper, what do they have to do? They actually have to make the online newspaper better than the printed newspaper. If they make it the same, then there's no reason for them to go to the online newspaper. They're used to the printed newspaper. They're used to things as they always have been. They have habits of reading their printed newspaper. They don't want to make a transition yet because nobody's given them incentive to make the transition yet. And so until they figure out that they need to make their online newspaper better than their offline newspaper, they will not get people to go. Now, how do you do that? Well, you make more multimedia, put more video, you offer new information, you offer new maybe games and maybe entertainment videos. I've suggested the New York Times should be starting its own TV network to do that. It's big enough, it has a good enough brand that it could compete with Netflix and the other online video providers if they would just do it. But it would require some investment. Disney and Turner are both announced they're going to spend $1 billion each to start competing with Netflix this year. That's one reason, by the way. It's not just those two. There's other companies also that have announced billion-dollar investments into online entertainment. That's one reason why I predict that local TV stations especially will start going broke very soon, because in America, the typical local TV station makes its profit primarily from what they call retransmission fees paid to the cable companies. The local cities require cable companies to carry the local TV stations, and then because they're carrying the local TV stations, the cable companies have to pay them a retransmission fee. And so that is their profit margin, basically. The local TV stations in America are making their profit off of cable. So what happens when more people go to Netflix than go to cable? And indeed, Netflix is cheaper than cable. And even you can get Netflix and Hulu for less than cable in America. And so if you are happy with Hulu and Netflix, and maybe add Turner or Disney or somebody else that comes into the market, and it's still cheaper than cable, then cable is going to start losing money big time. And if they lose money, then they stop paying so much money to local TV. And it becomes another tipping point in the history of media. And so they're in a position now that if the companies don't invest big money to make their product better, their online product better than their offline product, then they will die. If they do invest that money, they're risking a lot of money, and they might still die. It's kind of hard to go out to investors right now when they've lost money for the last 10 years and ask investors to invest more money because they want to try something new after failing for 10 years. And so investors aren't going to be real excited to invest in something that might pay a dividend, and give that money to a company that's been losing money for the last 10 years. That's kind of a hard sell. That's why I think most of the newspapers in America are going to go broke, and I think most of the TV stations are. It's actually going to be easier for somebody to come along and say, I'm going to start a new TV station or the equivalent of a new TV station on the internet, so I don't have all this debt to pay, because I haven't lost money over the years. So as the TV stations go broke, new online stations will be created to help cover local news and stuff. As the old newspapers die, new local newspapers will be developed on the internet and replace them. And so we may end up still with 10,000 newspapers in America, or maybe even 20,000. But they will be online, and they probably won't be owned by the companies that own the printed versions right now. So it all comes back to marketing. And marketing, you have to give people motivation to accept something new. And if you don't give them enough motivation, then that's like bread in Kazakhstan. They're not going to buy it. Even though it seems to make sense to most of the rest of the world to buy sliced bread. They're not buying it because nobody's convinced them to buy it. And nobody's decided to convince them that it's worth their while to buy sliced bread. So, and that's basically, like I say, true with all technology. Somebody has to figure out how to sell it. Otherwise, technology, even for Microsoft, as big as it is, one of the biggest corporations in the world, they haven't been able to sell this project that they were advertising 10 years ago and saying they were going to sell it to homes in 4 years. And it's now almost 10 years, and I haven't seen it anyplace. So even Microsoft can't do it just with the snap of the fingers. I'm going to show one more video before we start the student presentations.
There's a revolution going on right now in the way that people consume journalism. We're at a point where technology is to enable us to view and consume media in an entirely different way. Whether it's in paper, mobile devices, or iPhones, or the iPad, there are going to be a number of ways that people want to engage with that content. One thing that we've been great at doing is telling stories and communicating ideas and information. Whether you're an editor or an art director or designer, you're basically creating story art, just like a film director does or a musician. We've been able to do that in print. Our readers have relationships with brands. We have a great website, we have a great print magazine, and this is just adding one more avenue of communicating and connecting with the brand Wired. And really that's a huge opportunity for magazines. We really would like to offer more choices to our readers and to our advertisers and move beyond just the static notion of ink on a piece of paper.
What we're doing with Wired Magazine is collaborating on a digital version of their magazine with the same designers and creative people that publish the print version. Newer technologies like Adobe Air are now powering a new wave of interactive capability to display rich text, imagery, animation, interactivity, all within a single platform that can reach a variety of devices.
There's still going to be the rich storytelling, there's still going to be narrative art, but we'll be able to do it in short film and 360s, the ability to turn a product around and look at all sides of it.
There's this immersive experience which they can navigate completely by natural hand gestures back and forth between the pages of the magazines and all the entry points. If they want to dive deeper and read a full article, they scroll down, then that's, we've created a dual-axis navigation system.
At the bottom, we have what we call the scrubber. And it's got a little thumb that you can browse through and see every page in the issue, edit and advertising. Up at the top, we've got the browser, and by touching that, you get a visual overview of the entire magazine. It zooms back and shows you a magazine deconstructed.
We also have rich social features allowing people to clip articles, share them with friends, store them in their favorites bin. The ability to tweet about an article that you like, to post it to your Facebook page. It's a whole new world here for magazines.
This is what we've been waiting for 15 years. We've been waiting for an opportunity to use all these visual tools at our disposal to tell these stories in a way that is efficient, it is multidimensional. But we also think it's an opportunity to reset the economics. You know, for the first time, people may value this experience so much that they'll pay for it.
Advertising is as important as the editorial in all of our magazines, and especially in Wired. People come to Wired for the authority of the edit and the richness of the experience to learn about new products and services that our advertisers provide.
It's a really exciting time for publishing because the relationship the user has with the brand is now not just limited to the relationship with the traditional print version of that content, but also there's new ways now to establish those relationships with customers.
We want to build a way for our readers to engage with that content on any screen or device that they want to. These changes are on par with the changes that media experience going from radio to television.
Wired is known for breaking all the rules in print and doing really amazing things with their design, with their print publications. They're obviously one of the most forward-thinking publications out there. One of the reasons we teamed up with Wired was because we knew if we could solve their needs in this digital publishing world, then we could probably solve a lot of other magazines' needs. So it's really been a great collaboration between Wired and Adobe.
So again, as I was saying, Wired at least is trying to do some things. They're investing some money to try to make their online product better than their offline product. Add enough service to it with incorporating video, incorporating on their advertising side, making it so you can see, look at a car and turn it around and look at all sides of it. They're 360 advertising, things like that that you can't do with a printed newspaper. And there are similarly a lot of things like that newspapers could do that they're not doing. One of them definitely it should be video. I've said that before, but the 90 to 95% of the marketing executives say video is still the number one tool of marketing. And yet most newspapers are not selling video advertising. They're not using enough video themselves on their product. And so they're still trying to sell a printed product basically on the internet. So that is not value added. That's not enough motivation to move readers from one to the other. I've had other proposals. I did write a chapter in a book 2 years ago that gave some other ideas on how newspapers could save themselves. But it comes down to providing incentive to people to do something different. And so far, the newspapers have not provided that incentive for people to go online. Thus, they have lost 2/3 of their advertising over the last 10 years, and they've increased their online advertising very minimally, like less than doubling they less than doubled their online advertising, so that it's less than 10% of their overall revenue, and yet their overall revenue has dropped by 2/3. So it's just a slow death at this point, if they won't do something different. And at this point, nobody seems to be doing anything all that dramatically different. Where I'm going next week is to Arizona State University, and there's a author there, a professor there. I'm not sure if it's at Arizona State or if it's at University of Arizona, but at one of those two universities there, one of their professors wrote a book that basically concluded that newspapers ought to just give up trying to transition to the internet because they're all so crummy at it. That they've actually wasted resources trying to go on the internet that they could have conserved and not gone on the internet. They've spent a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of attention, and they have failed miserably to go onto the internet. And so her conclusion is stop trying. Stop wasting your time and money. Work on what you have and forget about the rest. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, although it might be true if they were going to be aiming at going to e-paper. If they were, as the first video that I showed those that were here, if they were moving to e-paper, then that in essence is moving their clientele online, but e-paper looks like paper. It looks like, except better, because you get the entire newspaper on one sheet of paper that you can flip over back and forth, and it provides new pages for you, but it's still just a piece of paper. And so that is enough like their current product, and yet still offers enough advantages that maybe if they were to stop trying to move people onto a website and instead move them to an e-paper newspaper, that might actually work. But I'm not sure that because few people have moved to e-paper, I'm not sure that it's cheap enough for somebody to do it without also risking a lot of money in making that transition. Because even though it exists, it isn't common, and as all things technical, they get cheaper as more people use them, and so if people aren't using them, they don't get cheaper. And so it may be that it's too much for a company to risk trying to go to e-paper at this point. But that's a possibility it is, like I say, it's different than going online because in essence, you're not on the internet. You are drawing your information from the internet onto a sheet of smart paper, of e-paper, and keeping the product essentially the same for your readers. And so you're adapting to them rather than asking them to adapt to you in a way. We'll see how that works out. Okay, we're to have.
So good evening to everybody. Today I will be talking about editing in broadcast media. So first, broadcast writing is a little bit different from normal news writing. It should be written and edited conversationally. Broadcast news has to be simple so that listeners can understand better, and language must be forceful so that listeners can pay full attention. Next, broadcast copy should talk. Broadcast copy uses sentence fragments, is rhythmic, and is best when active verbs are used. Broadcast writing stresses on plain talk, so the simpler it is, the better it is. And the lead of a broadcast copy equals to the headline of a newspaper. First, give a capsule of the news item, then the details. And newscasts should be arranged using transitions. Such transitions should be made with ideas and skillful organizations of facts and not with crutch words or catchphrases. Broadcast story should complement, not merely repeat what is obvious from any accompanying sound clips or videos. And next, sources of copy. Most sources of copy comes from local reporters, and news gathering associations. Some radio and TV stations subscribe to newspaper news service as well as to the broadcast newswire. Preparation of copy. Broadcast copies has to be easy for newscasters to read. There is a thing called teleprompter, which is like a screen which will project the script, the broadcast script. So teleprompter copy should average only 4 words in a line so that the eyes of the newscaster do not have to move back and forth. And newscaster usually don't need notes, but they will still have the notes with them in case the teleprompter fails to function. And all local copy should be triple spaced in capital and lowercase letters. If letter correction is to be made, the word should be scratched out and the correct word should be substituted. If copy requires excessive editing, correction should be made and a new copy has to be sent to the newscaster. No hyphens should be used. And put each story on a separate sheet and include pronunciation aids if needed, especially for place names. Some place names have different pronunciation in different regions. And moving on to broadcast style, there are a few elements under broadcast style which are abbreviation, punctuation, quotation mark, figure, titles, and time angle. So first, abbreviations. Abbreviations are short forms. So no abbreviations should be used except for some common usage such as doctor, Mrs., saint, and names or organizations widely known by their initials such as FBI, acronyms, time designation such as AM and PM, and academic degree such as PhD. And punctuations use dash or series of dots to indicate a pause, and hyphens are used instead of period in initials such as FBI, but periods are still retained in names such as J.D. Smith. And contractions are more commonly used, but avoid when broadcast writers want to stress verbs, especially the negative. Examples of contractions are words like isn't, doesn't, and it's. And quotation marks. Don't read quotation marks into script. Instead, use words such as these are his words, what she called, and the speaker said. Next are figures. Figures means numbers. Be aware that numbers can be easily misheard, and round numbers or approximation means as much as specific figures. For example, use about half rather than 48.2%. And fractions and decimals should be spelled out. And number under 10 and over 999 are spelled out and hyphenated. For example, 1, 2, 2000, and 1500. And when two numbers occur together, smaller numbers should be spelled out. For example, 12 10-ton trucks. Figure in the beginning of a sentence should be spelled out. Figures are used for time of day. For example, 4:30 this afternoon, in all market stories, and in sports scores and statistics. And in dates and addresses, the S, T, R, D, TH, and ND are included. For example, June 22nd and 83rd Street. And figures are used for years. And moving on to titles, identification usually precedes the name. For example, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And some radio and television newsroom insist that the president should never be referred by his last name alone. For example, President Obama, the President, or Mr. Obama. And seldom include middle initials and ages of person. Ages may be omitted unless the age is significant to the story. And obscure names need not be used unless warranted by the story. And time angle. In a newspaper wire story, almost everything happens in one day, but broadcast copy breaks up the day into parts. Next, taste. Broadcast news editors should be aware of all members of their audience, including the young, the aged, and the sensitive. Newscasters should avoid scenes that are too violent or project images that might make viewers uncomfortable. And the anchor should know the content of commercials sandwiched in news stories. For example, airliners generally insist that their commercials be cancelled for 24 hours if the newscast contains story of an airliner crash. And some stations insist on getting the coroner's approval before releasing names of accident victims. If the release is not available, the tag would be "Police are withholding the name of the victim until relatives have been notified." And soundbite. Soundbites is a short extract from a recorded interview or speech. Usually, a broadcast copy includes the date, time block, the story slug, writer's name or initials, the story source, and an indication whether the story has accompanying audio or video. If sound bites are used, a cue line is inserted for each. And if several sound bites are used in one newscast, there should be spaced so that the same voices or series of voices are not concentrated in one part. Out cues should be noted in the exact words of a person interviewed. And television news. Television news is a convergence of words, pictures, and sound. A good television script should not compete with the pictures. It should prepare viewers for what they are about to see or specify what may be difficult to see, but it should avoid what viewers can see or hear. So news editing requires more time for television than for radio. Before the local video is edited, it must be examined to determine how much to cut. And network newsfeed must also be examined. Producers also have to go over the news service stories and stories filed by local reporters. Today, digital editing is replacing videotape, making editing a lot more easier. Also, lightweight transmitters allows reporters to beam live reports back from remote location. So more and more broadcasts are also making use of video from the web, especially from YouTube. And there are something called citizen journalism, who are ordinary people who happens to be where news strikes. They gather sound and video with their cell phone and send it to a station or to the web. So, Q&A session. Broadcast style consists of which elements? Yes, the answer is abbreviation, title, figures, and quotation mark. So next, no abbreviations should be used except the answer is F, all of the above. And the last question is, newscaster should read quotation marks into script. True or false? Yes, the answer is false. That's all for my presentation. Thank you.
The stories, you might actually quote somebody directly in a broadcast news program, or at least make it known to the readers that it is a direct quote. Consequently, that changes how you write, because I've been teaching you in print that most direct quotes should be type 2 or type 3. Anybody remember what type 2 and type 3 is? Where's the attribution with type 2 and type 3? Okay, so at the end or in the middle. That, by the way, could be in your final exam, because it's something I tried to emphasize with you. So in text, your direct quotes are typically type 2 or type 3. You bring the attribution more towards the end, and you emphasize what's interesting, which is the quote. And the quote marks tell the reader this is a quote. And so there's no question this is a quote. But the type 1 then in print is reserved for indirect quotes. Not totally, but largely the indirect or the type 1 quotes are indirect quotes. They do not have quote marks. And you move the attribution to the start because of that. You don't want the reader to misunderstand who said this. You don't want the reader to think you're saying it as a journalist. And so you put right up to the front of an indirect quote, very frequently, who said it, and then what they said. So when you get moved to broadcast, basically everything that the anchor is going to say is going to be essentially, as far as the listener knows anyway, is an indirect quote. And therefore, all the attribution goes to the front. So again, there's rare exceptions, but they're fairly rare that you have anything but an indirect quote on or at least a type 1 quote. And as far as the reader is concerned, it's an indirect quote when it comes to the script that the anchor is going to read. And then you use your video as the direct quote, basically. So you should be aware of that. So you can distinguish, it depends who you're writing, what you're writing for, whether you're using type 1, type 2, type 3, and the circumstances. And in this case, broadcast, it'll be mostly type 1. Okay, next presenter, please. Please come up. I don't know. Who's up? We should have 3 presentations today. There's 3 people on the list. Are people hiding? They don't want to present? Well, while you're deciding whether or not anyone's going to come and present, just a reminder, next week you will not have a class. You will instead, sometime during the week, go to Open Lab and sign in. I need to make up a sign-up sheet or just maybe I'll just give the regular attendance sheet to FISA so that you can sign into the regular attendance sheet. So on next week, these classes, on the Thursday, or rather the Wednesday classes will not be held. You will have classes the next week, the last week of the semester. You will have classes, and the other groups, the Tuesday groups, will not have classes the last week. They will have classes next week. So anyway, you all end up with the same number of classes. And if you don't have a class, you have Open Lab and just go sign in. I will on Monday do some more discussion in my lecture. We'll go back to I'll actually do some demonstration of magazine layout and maybe show some more examples and show some more techniques that you might use in magazine. And then on the following week, I won't be here for the last lecture. So next week will be my last lecture. So on the last week, I won't be here. I will post a lecture on Moodle in the last week. And I will also have some other videos I want you to watch in conjunction with my video. I interviewed a Pulitzer Prize winner who was he won his Pulitzer Prize in print, but then transitioned to TV. I've got some other videos that are relevant to TV, are not necessarily exactly about TV, but they're about audio video anyway, and some tips on how to do audio better, and some tips on how to do documentaries, mini documentaries and stuff, which would be essentially the same techniques that you'd use for TV. So that's the plan. So there will be lecture on Monday. There will be tutorials on Tuesday, but Wednesday I'll be gone. So no tutorial for you guys next week. Okay, last call. Anybody presenting? If you don't present today, then your last chance would be the last week. Since you don't have class next week, since I'll be gone, then you have one more class to finalize presentations and get a score for that. Okay.